On a night when the wind howled like ghosts in the trees and the snow turned the world into a frozen grave, a knock came at Grant Whitaker's cabin door, but it wasn't a man, it wasn't even a dog. It was a bear, half-dead eyes full of something more human than wild begging for help, and against every instinct, every rule of survival. Grant let her in. He didn't know she was a mother. He didn't know her babies were dying just miles away, buried under snow. But he followed her, into the dark, into the cold, into something bigger than himself. And miles away, a young nurse named June Grieving, lost aching to feel, again was walking through her own winter. Drawn by a forgotten name in an old article, she went searching for a man who once believed in the sacred bond between man and nature. What she found was the moment everything began to thaw. This is not just a story of survival, it's a story of trust, of redemption, of a wounded man, a desperate mother, and the quiet miracle that brought them all back to life. The storm had arrived before sunset, sweeping across Cedarwild like a warning written in snow and wind. By nightfall, the forest was lost under white silence, and the air felt sharp enough to break skin. Trees bent beneath the weight of accumulating ice, and the wind screamed through their branches like something alive. Out by Alder Lake, where no road had been plowed in days, a single cabin stood wrapped in drifts, its chimney whispering smoke into the endless white. Inside, firelight flickered against log walls, casting trembling shadows onto the worn floor. Grant Whitaker sat by the wood stove motionless, except for the rising and falling of his chest. 43 years old, he carried solitude like a second skin. Once Grant had been a wildlife photographer with a growing reputation, a man who captured the breath of elk in winter and the delicate tension of a hawk mid-dive. Now he hadn't touched his camera in over a year. His tall frame had grown lean from months of isolation, and his face, framed by a thick beard and streaked with gray at the temples, was more familiar with silence than smiles. He had come to Cedarwild after losing everything. His wife Marianne and their daughter Phoebe had died 2 winters ago on a snowy highway not far from here. Grant had retreated from the world, the industry, the calls of concerned friends. The only sound he trusted now was the fire's crackle, the wind against the glass, and the muffled thud of snow from the roof. That's why, when the knock came, he froze. 3 dull, deliberate knocks, not frantic, not loud, but undeniable. He stared at the door for several seconds, unsure if he had imagined it. Then it came again. 1, 2, 3. He stood grabbing a flashlight from the wall. His boots were silent on the floorboards as he moved to the door. His breath held tight in his chest. He wasn't expecting anyone. No one should be here. The nearest neighbor was nearly 10 miles away, and the snow was thick enough to trap a man for days. He unlatched the bolt and opened the door just a few inches. The wind rushed in like something feral slapping his face with snow. But what made him reel back wasn't the cold. It was the creature standing just outside. A bear, a full-grown brown bear, though not in the strength of summer. This one was hunched, soaked with ice, its fur matted and dull. One foreleg dragged in the snow, a dark smear marking its path. Its eyes, amber and exhausted, locked on his. The bear didn't growl, didn't move. It stood there, breathing heavily, each exhale forming clouds of frost. Ice clung to its whiskers. Snow blanketed its back. Blood stained its paw. Grant's instincts screamed to shut the door. A bear this close, this calm, wasn't normal, especially not in winter. They should have been hibernating deep in dens, not wandering in snowstorms. And yet this one had come to his porch, had knocked. He didn't know how long he stood there, eyes locked with the animal. But something about the bear's gaze held him. It wasn't just pain, it wasn't rage. It was something pleading, something human. Very slowly, Grant closed the door, but he didn't bolt it. He stood in the center of the room, heart pounding. The storm roared against the roof. The shadows danced. And outside, something waited. 10 miles south in the quiet town of Pinebrook, June. Holloway sat alone in her mother's old kitchen. The storm had found the town too covering roads, cars, and memories in a thick white hush. Her fingers wrapped around a cold mug of tea she hadn't touched in an hour. A candle flickered on the windowsill, casting a soft glow on her tired face. June was 28. Her features were kind, thoughtful, though lately drawn. Her hair, chestnut and thick, was pulled into a loose braid. She wore a gray wool cardigan over scrubs she no longer needed to wear. She hadn't gone to the hospital in weeks. She had once been a nurse who loved her work, especially with children. But that was before her mother, Young, Strong, her best friend, had collapsed suddenly in this very kitchen from a brain aneurysm. June had performed CPR with shaking hands. She had waited for the ambulance, but her mother never opened her eyes again. Since that day, June had drifted. Her days bled into nights. She avoided old colleagues, ignored her voicemail, let dishes pile in the sink. The grief wasn't sharp. It was slow, dull, and heavy. And she didn't know what to do with it. That night, the wind howled against the windows. Snow curled in the corners of the glass. June leaned her forehead against the cool pane and stared out into the storm. She felt like something lost in the snow herself, quiet, unsure of direction, waiting for something she couldn't name. Back at the cabin, Grant watched the fire dance as the wind shrieked outside. He hadn't moved. The bear's image haunted his thoughts, the ice in its fur, the tremor in its legs, the way its gaze never wavered. It didn't make sense. But then again, very little had for a long time. He stood, walked to the window, and peered through the frost. The bear was still there, slumped now as if too weak to leave. The wind swept snow over its back. It didn't even flinch. Grant's breath fogged the glass. For the first time in 2 years, he didn't feel completely alone. The bear's body was heavy, not only in weight but in silence. Steam curled off her damp fur as she lay sprawled across the cabin floor, a quilt barely holding warmth against her battered frame. Grant Whitaker crouched beside her, every muscle in his back burning from the effort of dragging her across the threshold. But the tremble in his hands wasn't from exertion, it was from something else. He hadn't touched another living being in over a year, and now here he was, kneeling beside a half-frozen grizzly in his living room. The fire crackled steadily in the stove, casting a soft orange halo over the bear's flanks. Her breathing was shallow, uneven. She hadn't moved since he laid her down, except for the occasional twitch of her paw. Grant reached for the battered green first aid kit under his workbench, dusted with sawdust and time. The contents were modest gauze ointment, medical tape, antiseptic. Enough for a hiking injury, maybe, not for this, not for a bear. Still, he returned to her side and lifted her injured leg carefully. Her fur was matted with blood and snow, the paw swollen and torn deep across the pads. He cleaned the wound as gently as he could, murmuring words he wasn't sure she could understand. "You didn't come here to die," he said softly, applying antiseptic. She flinched, groaned a low, breathy sound, but didn't resist. Her eyes remained half-lidded, cloudy with exhaustion but alive. As he finished bandaging the paw, something caught his eye, her underside. The teats were swollen, red. She was lactating. Grant's brow furrowed. "You're a mother," he murmured. The air inside the cabin suddenly felt colder. If she had cubs, where were they? His thoughts tumbled. She must have left them behind. Or worse. He looked again at her paw, the way it had dragged across the porch, and the dark trail in the snow. She hadn't just wandered here. She had made a choice. "You came here. For them, he whispered. But her eyes had drifted shut, her chest barely lifting with each breath. He sat back, rubbing his hands against the fatigue building in his arms. The room had gone very quiet except for the fire. For the first time in months, the silence didn't press in on him like a tomb. It simply sat with him like company, miles away in the quiet town of Pinebrook. June. Holloway sat on the edge of her mother's bed, a single desk lamp lighting the worn pages of a magazine spread open in her lap. Outside, the wind whistled past the eaves of the house, carrying flurries of snow against the window panes. The heater buzzed faintly in the hallway, but June didn't notice the cold. Her fingers had frozen on the page. The magazine was an old issue of Northwest Wild, tucked between recipe books in her mother's kitchen drawer. She hadn't been looking for anything in particular, just something to fill the space that had stretched endlessly around her since her mother passed. But as she flipped through it, her eyes stopped on a photo of a bald eagle, mid-flight wings bent against a gray sky. The article beneath was titled, "The Quiet Between Us Finding Connection in the Wild," by Grant Whitaker. The name meant nothing at first. But as she read his words about the isolation of photographing wildlife, about the silence of the forest, and the moments of strange sacred contact with animals, something stirred. He had written not just about nature, but about grief, about watching a fox bury its mate and sit beside the mound, about holding still long enough for a deer to let him breathe beside her. It wasn't just observation. It was reverence. She read the byline again. He had lived in Oregon. Lived. Past tense. She grabbed her laptop and searched his name. The internet returned fragments. Old articles award lists one gallery from 5 years ago. Then silence. A whisper of a man who had once been something, and then vanished. One result, buried deep, mentioned a remote cabin in Cedarwild, a place with no phone, no signal, a last known address. June stared at the screen. Her fingers curled slightly over the edge of the desk. She didn't know exactly why, but something had shifted. The words had touched something raw in her, something she hadn't let herself feel since her mother's death. She closed the laptop gently and looked toward the window. The snow was still falling. In the morning, when the storm lifted, she would pack a bag. She had to see for herself if someone who understood that much silence could help her listen to her own. The morning after the storm, Cedarwild emerged under a pale, gauzy light. Snow blanketed everything in a soft hush, reshaping the landscape into unfamiliar curves and white silence. Tree limbs bowed beneath the weight of it, and the lake was hidden beneath a sheet of unbroken frost. Grant Whitaker stood at the window, one hand cradling a chipped mug of black coffee, his eyes not on the beauty of the forest, but on the bear. She lay where she had collapsed the night before, near the stove, the heat having pulled the damp from her fur. Her breathing had steadied. The makeshift bandage around her paw, though clumsy, was holding. But what caught his attention now was her gaze. The bear was awake. Her amber eyes, clearer, sharper, were fixed not on Grant, but on the door. At first he thought it was instinct, the scent of pine and snow, the promise of wilderness maybe. But as the minutes passed and she didn't look away, it became something else. Her head would turn slightly, ears, twitching, nose, lifting as if tasting something on the air, something Grant could not sense. And then she would look at the door again and again. Grant watched this behavior for over an hour, pacing the floor. Something inside him wrestled. He knew she wanted to go. He knew that whatever had brought her here, whatever desperation had driven her across miles of forest on a mangled paw, was not finished. She was healing, yes, but healing only in part. And she wasn't alone. That truth haunted him. Somewhere out there in the woods, thick with snow and silence, there were cubs, maybe alive, maybe waiting, maybe freezing. He sighed, running a hand down his face, and looked at the snowshoes propped by the door. His coat still hung on the wall hook, damp from the night before. "I must be out of my mind," he muttered. Behind him, the bear shifted. Her paw scraped faintly across the floor, a whisper of movement. Her eyes met his for the first time that day, and he understood. She wasn't just asking to leave. She was asking him to follow. At the edge of Cedar Wild June, Holloway stepped out of a dusty gray Subaru and into a world blanketed in stillness. The road behind her was now only a single lane, carved through walls of snow, winding back toward Pine Brook. The last ranger station had warned her that Cedar Wild was mostly uninhabited. Some old cabins, a few seasonal hikers, no cell service. When she asked about a man named Grant Whitaker, the ranger had only shrugged and handed her a paper map with the vaguest of directions. June pulled her beanie lower over her ears. She was bundled in a navy winter coat that looked slightly too large on her, a hand-me-down from her mother. A small backpack rested against her hip, filled with essentials: first aid snacks, water, flashlight, and the magazine with Grant's article folded tightly inside. Her breath puffed into the air in faint white clouds as she stared at the vast tree line before her. No footprints. No cabins in sight. A man like Grant, she figured, wouldn't live near the road. He'd be farther in. Somewhere quiet. Somewhere unreachable. She adjusted her gloves and began walking her boots, crunching along the snow-packed shoulder of what had once been a service path. After a few minutes, she came upon a clearing that opened out toward a frozen lake. The ice stretched for what looked like miles, untouched and glimmering under the pale sky. "I'll start here," she whispered, and began following the edge of the lake, scanning the tree line for any sign of smoke movement or life. Back in the cabin, Grant strapped the snowshoes over his boots and filled a small canvas pack with essentials, extra bandages, 2 bottles of water jerky aflare, and an old map of the area. He hesitated by the stove, then tossed 2 more logs onto the fire. He wouldn't be gone long. Couldn't be. The bear had already made it to the door, one heavy paw resting against the frame, her breath fogging against the wood. When Grant opened the door, she stepped outside without looking back. It was slow at first. Her injured leg still trembled under her weight, and the path through the snow was uneven, hard. But she moved with purpose. Her nose twitched constantly, her head turning as if mapping invisible threads of scent only she could follow. Grant followed at a distance, careful to step where she stepped. The trees closed in around them, heavy with snow. Sunlight pierced through only in broken beams. The world felt smaller here, older. An hour passed, then another. Every so often the bear would pause, turn back to look at him, her gaze calm, unwavering, and then continue. And every time she did, Grant felt the knot in his chest tighten. He wasn't just following an animal. He was walking towards something he didn't yet understand. June had walked the lake's edge for nearly 2 hours before she saw it. A curl of smoke, faint and low, rising through the trees near a bend in the shoreline. She stopped. Her pulse quickened. It was far off, and it could belong to anyone or to no one. But her gut told her otherwise. She adjusted the strap on her backpack and began veering into the woods toward it, navigating between thick pines and frozen underbrush. As she walked, she thought again about the article. Grant had written about stillness, about watching without expectation, about meeting a wolf's eyes across a field, and realizing neither of them felt the need to run. She had thought about that paragraph for days. Now, as she picked her way between trees, she felt something similar, like the forest was watching her back. The forest narrowed into a ravine. As the hours passed, the trees thinning into jagged silhouettes, standing guard over deep, uneven snow. Grant's breath came heavy now, each exhale a plume of white, as he trudged after the bear through waist-high drifts. The gash in the landscape ahead formed a natural funnel winds, carving through it with a constant whispering hum. The bear had slowed. Her injured leg dragged more heavily behind her now, her steps uneven, but she pushed forward with a quiet urgency, glancing back just once to ensure Grant was still following. He was. Snow crunched underfoot the sky above, graying into mid-afternoon haze. They rounded a steep bend, and there beneath a sloped rock ledge dusted in ice, the bear stopped. Her entire body lowered into a crouch, ears forward. A low rumble trembled in her throat, not warning, but something more primal. Grant's eyes scanned the ledge, and then he saw them. Two small figures huddled together in the hollow where the wind was weakest, curled against one another in a tight, desperate knot of fur. The cubs. They were smaller than he'd expected, barely the size of a large dog. One darker, with a silver patch across its spine, the other tawny, almost golden. Their eyes were closed, their limbs tucked in. He wasn't sure at first if they were even breathing. The snow had nearly buried them. He dropped to his knees beside the ledge, the cold biting through his jeans instantly. He reached out, brushing snow from their backs. At the contact, the darker cub stirred, emitting a high-pitched whimper, followed by the faintest tremor from its sibling. "They're alive," he breathed. The mother bear let out a long, rattled exhale and slumped beside the cubs, curling her body protectively around them. Grant didn't move, watching the quiet reunion with a kind of reverence he hadn't felt in years. But it wasn't over. Not yet. They wouldn't survive out here. He reached for the larger cub, cradling its cold body against his chest, then gently lifted the second, swaddling it in the flannel from his pack. The mother bear rose slowly and backed away, her eyes locked on his hands, but made no move to intervene. "You're coming too," Grant said softly. "All of you." Back in Cedarwild, June, Holloway stumbled through the ever-thickening woods, following the faint trail that had led her toward the chimney smoke she'd seen from the lakeside clearing. Her boots were soaked to the ankle, and her breath came in short bursts through the scarf wrapped tight across her face. Snow clung to her coat and lashes, but her determination kept her going. As she crested a narrow ridge, a voice called out, "You're either brave or lost, young lady. Maybe both." She turned sharply. An old man leaned on a split walking stick just a few yards ahead. He wore a thick wool coat patched in several places and a hunter-green beanie that drooped over one ear. His beard was full white and speckled with pine needles. His eyes, pale blue and sharp, despite his age, held a smile behind them. "I'm guessing you're not here looking for firewood," he added, shifting his weight slightly. "No," June panted. "I'm looking for someone. Grant Whitaker. Do you know him?" The man raised his eyebrows. "Haven't heard that name spoken in a while. Most folks think he disappeared." June adjusted her pack. "I think he's here, somewhere near that smoke." She gestured toward the trees. The old man chuckled. "That smoke is from my cabin. You just happened to walk past mine on your way to his." He offered a hand. "Name's Chester Nolan. Used to do trail maintenance for the county. Now I mostly argue with squirrels and read old war books." June smiled and shook his hand. "June Holloway, I'm a nurse. Or I was. Well, June, the nurse or not, you're in luck. I know where Grant lives. He won't be easy to find, though. Doesn't see many people, might not even answer the door. I just want to talk," she said. "That's all." Chester nodded. "Then let me point you the right way." He reached into the breast pocket of his coat and pulled out a small notepad. With a pencil stub, he drew a rough path through the woods, marking off a fork near a bent pine tree and a half-collapsed fence. He handed the page to her and gave a soft pat on the shoulder. "You tell him Chester says he still owes me a jar of blackberry jam." June laughed, her cheeks flushed from cold and gratitude. "I'll do that." Grant moved with slow, deliberate steps through the snow. One cub pressed to his chest, the other tucked in the folds of his coat, both shivering but responsive. The mother bear walked beside him, her pace steady despite her wound, her massive frame flanking his like a silent sentinel. The path back was harder. The snow had thickened since morning, and each step was a test of balance and will. But Grant didn't stop, not once. By the time the cabin came into view, dusk had already begun to color the sky in soft hues of lavender and blue. Smoke curled from the chimney. Light flickered in the windows. He reached the porch and gently laid the cubs onto the thick wool blanket he had left near the stove. One let out a soft cry. The other curled immediately into the warmth. The mother bear stepped inside, last slow and careful, her paw dragging slightly. She collapsed near the cubs, her breathing deep but controlled. Grant sat beside them, the heat soaking into his bones. For a long while he said nothing. He simply watched as the family, broken but whole again, curled together near the fire. Something in his chest ached, but not with sorrow. For the first time in years it was warmth. The fire crackled low in the cabin as morning broke, casting golden light through frost-laced windows. The snow outside had softened its hard edges, blurred by the sun now peeking through the pine canopy. Inside, the air was warm, laced with the scent of pine-burnt cedar and the subtle musk of animals. Grant Whitaker stood at the stove, stirring a pot of hot water, watching the steam curl upward like slow-moving ghosts. Behind him, the mother bear rested, her massive frame curled protectively around her cubs. The golden one, now affectionately called Sun, in Grant's thoughts, slept soundly with its head tucked into her fur. The darker cub, smaller and slightly weaker, blinked open its eyes as Grant knelt beside them to place a shallow bowl of warmed water near their reach. They wouldn't drink much, but he hoped the scent might coax them. The bandages on the mother's paw had held through the night, and the swelling had begun to reduce. Grant had done everything within his knowledge, and then a bit more driven not by expertise but instinct. An old buried compassion that he hadn't known still lived in him. These weren't just wild creatures anymore. They were guests, survivors, sacred somehow. He leaned back against the table, holding the mug in both hands, watching as the small family huddled closer. The silence in the room was different now, not oppressive, not empty, but full of breathing, full of warmth, full of life. Then the knock came. 3 soft, hesitant taps at the door. Not wind, not an echo. Grant froze. The bear stirred but didn't rise. She lifted her head slightly, sniffing the air but made no sound. Grant set down his mug and approached the door slowly. He wasn't expecting anyone. He never expected anyone. The last person to knock on this door had been a ranger checking on permits nearly 2 years ago, and even then Grant hadn't answered. He opened the door part way. Standing in the snow, wrapped in a blue winter coat, 2 sizes too big, was a young woman with flushed cheeks and dark hair tied in a lopsided bun. Her eyes, hazel alert, met his with hesitation and something else. Recognition. "Grant Whitaker?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. She pulled the magazine from her bag, slightly creased and damp from the journey, and held it up like a peace offering. "I read your article about the fox and the forest. I wanted to find you." Grant's brow furrowed. The cold crept past his ankles. He studied her face, too young to be a journalist, not dressed like a hiker, and she didn't have the guardedness of a fan. She looked tired, like someone who hadn't slept well in months. "You came all the way out here for that?" he asked, voice gruff. She nodded. "I'm June Holloway. I used to be a nurse." As she hesitated, her fingers tightening on the magazine. "I lost my mother 6 months ago. I didn't know how to keep going. And then I found this. Your words. They sounded like someone who understood. A long silence passed between them. Grant looked down, saw the wear in her boots, the red at the tips of her ears. He opened the door wider. "Come in." She stepped inside, brushing snow from her coat. Her eyes adjusted to the warmth and dimness slowly, then widened. "Oh." The bear lifted her head. The cubs were still nestled into her side, but one gave a small squeak, barely audible. June didn't scream. She didn't even flinch. Instead, she stood frozen, a kind of reverence overtaking her expression. "She came to your door," June whispered. Grant nodded. "She's not the first lost thing to end up here." June removed her gloves and crouched near the stove, keeping a respectful distance. The bear watched her for a moment, then lowered her head again. "I didn't know what I expected," June said quietly, "but it wasn't this." Grant poured a second mug of water and handed it to her. She took it with both hands, her fingers shaking. They sat like that for a long while, two strangers tethered by shared silences. Finally, Grant spoke. "Where did you come from, Pine Brook?" "That's a long walk. I drove most of the way, then hiked. I met someone, Chester Nolan, said you owed him jam." Grant let out a dry laugh. "Of course he did." June smiled. It was the first real smile she'd shown in days. "I didn't come here to intrude," she said. "I just needed to know you were real." Grant looked down at his hands, at the line of dirt beneath his nails, at the flannel sleeve rolled up unevenly past his wrist. "I'm real, just not always sure if that's a good thing." Outside, the wind had softened. The trees were still. And inside the cabin, a bear slept with her cubs beside a fire, while two people broken in their own quiet ways sat not far from one another, each warmed not just by heat, but by the slow, unfamiliar sensation of being seen. The snow had begun to melt in slow trickles along the base of the pines, soaking into the moss and softening the trail underfoot. It wasn't much, just a hint of spring in the air, but enough for the forest to feel alive again. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled low as Grant double-checked the straps on the sled. The two bear cubs, now noticeably stronger, nestled inside the heavy wool blankets they'd grown accustomed to. The mother bear waited near the door, her breath steady, her injured paw planted more firmly now. She stood tall, her amber eyes watchful, but no longer dull with pain. June stepped out from the kitchen with a tin of water. She knelt beside the sled, offering it to the cubs, who sniffed at the rim and lapped slowly. Her movements were careful, practiced, her nursing instincts quietly resurfacing. Her hair was braided and tucked beneath her cap cheeks, pink from the fire. Her presence in the cabin, though still new, had settled into a rhythm Grant hadn't expected. Quiet. Natural. "She's ready," June said softly, glancing toward the bear. Grant nodded. "We all are." Together, they pushed open the cabin door. The air outside was crisp, filled with the scent of thawing soil and pine bark. The bear stepped out first, descending the porch with slow but certain steps. Her breath rose in soft clouds, the early sun catching in the mist. The sled followed, sliding gently over the softened snow, with Grant guiding from the front and June steadying the back. The journey began in silence, the only sounds the crunch of their boots and the quiet rasp of the sled's runners over patches of ice and earth. The mother bear led the way, moving through the woods with a sense of direction that needed no map. Grant had studied bears for most of his life, and yet he found himself surprised again by how precisely she knew where to go. The trail narrowed into a corridor of firs, thick trunks rising on either side like sentinels. Light spilled in through the canopy in fractured beams, illuminating flakes of bark and the odd flutter of a winter bird darting between branches. They walked for nearly an hour, the forest shifting from familiar to unknown with every step deeper. Then the bear paused. They had come to the edge of a shallow valley wrapped in old trees and cradled by a low ridge on the eastern side. At the center, a slow-moving stream cut through the clearing, its surface cracked with thaw, but still rimmed in snow. Beside the stream, under a rock overhang, was a natural shelter part, earthen hollow part den lined with leaf litter and shadows. The bear sniffed the air, then looked back at Grant. He stopped letting the sled rest on the slope. June moved beside him but said nothing. The mother bear padded forward toward the den, her large paws pressing firm prints into the melting snow. The cubs stirred as she approached, their ears twitching, little noses sniffing. She paused at the mouth of the shelter, then turned around. Grant had no words for what passed between them. It wasn't language, it wasn't instinct. It was something older, some silent understanding forged in cold nights, quiet caretaking, and mutual survival. He knelt, lifted one cub, then the other, cradling them as gently as he could. They whimpered softly in his arms. The golden one turned its face toward his coat, as if recognizing the warmth it had grown used to. He carried them slowly across the clearing, the mother bear, watching with complete stillness. As he set the first cub down at the threshold of the den, the mother moved closer, nuzzling it with her snout. The darker cub followed next, its tiny claws catching on the edge of the blanket before it wriggled onto the packed soil. The family was whole again. Grant stepped back, wiping his palms on his jacket. The bear gave a long exhale, low and soft, before lowering herself beside the cubs. The three of them curled together as if they had never been apart. The stream beside them babbled faintly, the wind threading gently through the trees. June stood beside him, arms wrapped across her chest. "They're safe now," she whispered. Grant nodded, still staring. They didn't speak again. There was nothing to say. The sun had risen higher over the valley, stretching long shafts of golden light across the snow-laced ground. The den now sat in shadow, cradled beneath the outcrop like a heartbeat beneath skin. The mother bear was curled protectively around her cubs, both now asleep, their tiny sides rising and falling with the slow rhythm of peace. Grant stood several paces away, his breath misting in the morning air, eyes locked on the scene he had helped piece back together. He didn't want to move, not because of the cold or the weight in his legs, but because some part of him knew that when he turned away, it would truly be over. The bear lifted her head. Her amber eyes found his. They held there not with fear, nor with gratitude in the way humans understand, but with something deeper, wordless. A knowing. A kind of sacred farewell that didn't need translation. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then the bear, slow and deliberate, lowered her head again and closed her eyes. June stood a few feet behind Grant. She had stayed silent, giving him space, her gloved hands folded in front of her. Her coat was dusted in snow, her cheeks flushed from the cold and the quiet hike. She had seen enough of the world to understand that this moment didn't need commentary. It simply needed to be honored. Grant finally turned his boots, pressing soft prints into the melting snow. June joined him as he stepped away from the den. They began the climb back out of the valley, the forest folding around them once more. For several minutes, the only sounds were the distant creak of branches, the muted call of a jay, and the shuffle of their feet over thawing ground. Oh, then, without speaking, June reached out. Her hand slid into Grant's. It was tentative, not forced, not performative. It was simply human. A gesture of presence, of solidarity in the aftermath of something that neither of them fully understood. Grant didn't look at her, didn't speak. But he didn't let go either. His fingers curled gently around hers, and together they walked in silence, side by side beneath the soft shadows of pines. The trail back to the cabin felt different. The forest, though unchanged, no longer loomed the same way it had days before. The snow, though thick in places, had lost its edge. The wind that whispered between the trees now carried a kind of hush, not warning but welcome. And perhaps most telling of all, Grant noticed the light. Not just the way it broke through the trees or glinted off frost, but the way it warmed things, how it touched bark and ground and skin. He hadn't seen that in a long time. By the time they reached the clearing, the cabin stood like a memory made real again. Smoke curling from the chimney, the woodpile stacked with the care of someone who planned for things. June stepped ahead and pushed open the door, while Grant unlatched the sled, now empty, except for a wool blanket and a few scattered pine needles. He followed her inside and paused at the threshold. It was quiet. The hearth still held embers from the morning fire. The old kettle rested on the stove, steam barely rising. The same photographs hung on the wall, elk in mist, osprey in flight, the ridgeline caught in a winter dusk. But something had shifted. The cabin no longer felt like a place he hid from the world. It felt lived in, touched by story. It no longer echoed with emptiness. It held something. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him. June was at the window staring out at the path they had just returned from. The afternoon light painted soft lines across her face. She turned slightly when she heard him and offered a tired smile. "You okay?" she asked. He nodded slowly. "I think I am." She leaned against the frame. "You did something good. Not everyone would have opened that door." Grant crossed to the fire, crouched beside it, and added a log. The flames stirred, crackling to life with renewed warmth. "I don't know what's next," he said, still facing the fire. "You don't have to," she replied. "Sometimes healing isn't about knowing. Sometimes it's just choosing not to close the door again." He looked over his shoulder at her. There was something open in his expression now, unguarded, honest. June walked to the table and set the kettle back on the burner. "Do you think they'll be okay?" she asked. Grant stared into the flames for a moment. They have each other. And this forest, it's wild, but it's theirs. I think that's enough. A beat passed. Then June whispered almost to herself, "Sometimes that's all we need, too." They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling softly between them. And for the first time in a long while, neither of them felt alone. The snow had thinned into pockets of soft slush, retreating into the shaded roots of the pines. The air still held a bite, but the light was different now. It lingered longer in the sky, stretching across the tops of the trees in quiet amber, before dipping behind the ridge. Spring had not yet arrived, but winter was no longer sharp enough to cut. Grant stood on the porch, a hand wrapped around a mug of tea gone cold. His boots creaked on the old wood as he stepped forward, eyes fixed on the tree line beyond the clearing. The wind carried only the faintest rustle of pine needles. It had been 3 weeks since they left the mother bear and her cubs in the hidden valley. 3 weeks of quiet, of healing, of firelight and slow mornings and words exchanged in the calm. 3 weeks since something in him began to loosen grief, still present, but no longer crushing. And now, she was back. He saw her before he heard her, the massive form just beyond the edge of the trees. The 2 cubs flanked her, taller now, more alert. The golden one stood with its snout high, the darker one clumsily pawing at the melting snow. The mother didn't move closer. She stood there, framed by the last light of day, just watching. Grant didn't speak. He didn't need to. He stepped down from the porch and stopped a dozen feet from the edge of the clearing. June stepped out beside him, her hand finding his, their fingers laced without thought. The bear tilted her head ever so slightly. The cubs looked toward them but didn't stir. It was not a reunion, it was a witnessing. June's voice came low, reverent. "She came to show you they made it." The bear held their gaze for another long moment. Then, just as slowly, she turned. The cubs followed without hesitation, and the trio melted back into the forest, silent as snowfall. 2 months later, the cabin pulsed with a different kind of energy. Gone was the air of isolation, the sense of a forgotten place tucked at the edge of the world. In its place, children's laughter rang through the clearing. Grant had re-nailed the porch boards, cleared brush from the perimeter, and built 3 low benches beneath the pines with June's help. The fire pit had been reshaped into a circle of warm stones, and the old sled now leaned upright against the cabin wall, painted in wild colors by a 7-year-old girl with bright red mittens. It was the first session of the Nature and Renewal program. 6 kids, aged 6 to 12, sat cross-legged in the moss beside the fire. Most were from Pine Brook, some from neighboring towns. A few were foster children, others from families recovering from grief or loss. All of them were here because someone, a parent, a counselor, a teacher, believed they needed more than textbooks and therapy. They needed connection. Grant knelt beside a weathered wooden crate, pulling out a small canvas bag filled with camera viewfinders. The real cameras would come later. For now, it was about learning to see. "Close one eye," he said, holding up a viewfinder, "and look through this. Not with the goal of taking a picture, but to notice something. The texture of a leaf, the shape of a shadow, the space between branches, the small things we forget to see." The children fumbled with the viewfinders, laughing and squinting. One boy, Mason, 9 years old and too quiet for his age, pointed toward the ridgeline. "There's a deer. I saw its tail move." Grant smiled. "That means you're paying attention. That's the first step." Behind him, June sat on a low stool, cradling a thermos. She wore a green flannel shirt and hiking boots, muddied at the soles. Her hair was tied back loosely, wisps curling around her temples. She looked more alive than she had in months, more rooted. She'd become the emotional center of the program, gently helping kids name what they were feeling, through stories and questions that never pushed too hard. A new character joined them, then Sarah Deacon, a local art therapist in her early 50s, with short silver blonde hair and kind eyes magnified behind rounded glasses. She was stocky, usually wore patched corduroy pants and scarves in earthy tones, and always carried a pouch of clay in her pack. Sarah was soft-spoken but firm, known for giving quiet hugs and firm redirection when needed. She'd volunteered to guide the afternoon session, helping the children shape animals out of clay. "That bear you saw?" She asked Mason, kneeling beside him. "What did it make you feel?" He hesitated, then whispered, "Safe." Sarah nodded. "Good. Let's make that." Soon, clay bears began to take form, some lopsided, some too small, some enormous and round. Grant watched them, his eyes misting, but not from sadness, from awe. At sunset, the children lined up to dip their fingers in warm water, wash clay from their skin, and sip cider June had heated over the fire. One girl lingered behind a shy 11-year-old named Ellie, who rarely spoke. She held a small clay bear cupped in both hands, the edges smoothed with care. She looked up at Grant and whispered, "Did she come back?" Grant crouched beside her. "Yes, one evening. Just to show us she was okay." Ellie nodded, gripping the bear tighter. "I think she knew you missed her." Grant didn't answer. He just smiled. That night, after the children were picked up and the fire had gone cold, Grant and June stood together by the window. The cabin was quiet again, but no longer empty. Outside, the forest breathed. Inside, something new had been planted. Grant looked down at June. "You ever think we'd end up doing this?" She laughed softly. "I didn't even think I'd find you." He chuckled. "And yet here we are." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "I think this place was always waiting," she said, for us to bring it back. He didn't answer, but his hand reached for hers. Outside, beneath the pale moonlight, the clearing was still waiting for tomorrow's laughter, tomorrow's stories, and the healing yet to come. Sometimes, the greatest miracles come not as thunderclaps or lightning bolts, but as quiet footsteps in the snow, as a knock on the door from a wounded creature, or as a stranger who reaches for your hand in silence. This story is not just about a bear or grief or a cabin in the woods. It is about how God speaks to us through nature, through second chances, and through people we never expected to meet. Just like the mother bear found her way back to safety, and just as Grant and June found their way back to hope, you too can find healing, no matter how long the winter has lasted in your life. God doesn't always rescue us by removing the storm. Sometimes He sends someone to walk with us through it. If this story moved your heart, please share it with someone who might need a sign of hope today. Leave a comment below with Amen if you believe God still works through quiet miracles. And don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more stories that inspire, and may God bless you and your loved ones with peace, strength, and unexpected grace.